Thank you for joining us today on the Janice Oasis. I'm Nola Simon, I'm the host. And today we actually have the chairman of Intrinsic Labs, who is Sharath Jeevan. And I actually just finished reading his book, which is called Intrinsic. And he's an expert in motivation. And his work really focuses on purpose, autonomy, and mastery, and how we can actually create a better world, a better life, and just have more fulfillment to our lives. So welcome, Sharath. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, and a real pleasure to be on the show today.
Is there anything I missed in the introduction that you would like me to highlight?
No, I think it's great. I think, as you said, no, I came to this, I'm not a psychologist by background. I got into this really by working in education, running an initiative that reached about 35,000 schools. I got very interested by these topics of motivation, direction, and potential, and really excited about applying those concepts now, building off the book into a whole range of areas in our lives, particularly work and careers. So yeah, very excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually what caught my attention. You did an awful lot of work with teachers in a lot of different areas of the world, but particularly with like areas where there really weren't a lot of resources and the teachers were highly monitored, right? So one aspect in the book that caught my attention was you were able to work with teachers and really help them remember why they started doing the work to begin with, but also how much autonomy they really did have, even though they were tightly controlled and had a specific curriculum. So I find that interesting. How can we actually, like in the workplace, if you've got knowledge workers, how can you encourage them, even if it's tightly controlled, you've got compliance, how can we encourage them to find more autonomy?
It's a great question. And just to give you an example from the US, and if you look at teachers, you mentioned that, and that's how I did a lot of my early learning. I think 1.6 million teachers have left the workforce in the US over the pandemic years. So these are real challenges. We're not talking about marginal issues here at all. Just to bring, and I'd argue a teacher is a kind of knowledge worker, of course. But if you take the lens much more broadly, I work with groups like L'Oreal, Shopify, large corporates, all the way to governments and social sector organizations like Teach for All, who the mother organization of Teach for America, etc. And what I'd say on that question of autonomy is that, yeah, I think what tends to happen is we tend to go in either extreme. We either believe we're completely micromanaged, and therefore we find it hard to find a real sense of impact in our work. We feel like we've got to check every policy, we've got to check everything with our manager or boss. It can feel very disempowering often. That's one extreme. The other extreme is, though, we all want to be Clint Eastwood or Elon Musk and just go off and do whatever we want. And I think that's also usually unrealistic. I think in most organizations, if we're in organizations, we also have to make sure we align with where the organization is going as well. And I think there's a nice middle ground in the middle, which I call guided autonomy. It's not complete Wild West, but there's this real strong sense of agency and an impact in that sort of position. And it's almost like a marriage. And I think that's where work is going. It's before what happened when I started working 30 years ago, the company would say jump and you'd ask how high. That was pretty much the work deal, the proposition. Nowadays, I see work more and more like a marriage where we've got to make sure we're helping the company or organization achieve its own mission statement, of course. But I believe all of us should have a mission statement also. That's one that's more personal, that's beyond the immediate company. It's longer, it's our North Star. And I think the role of the company or organization is to help us achieve our mission statement as well. And so I think when it's those two things are happening together, there's a mutual respect, a mutual sense of obligation, a mutual sense of impact we're both having. And like a good marriage or a good relationship of any kind, there's a really powerful two-way deal. And that's where I love the world of work to go towards that new deal. And I think autonomy is the key in that, because I think that sense that if every worker can feel able to drive things in a way that really feels authentic to them and important to them, but also they need to respect key employee values. For example, it might be around diversity or around whatever aspect it is. It's that sort of middle ground that's really interesting.
Exactly. And that's how you're tying it back to purpose as well, too. Like hopefully your employees are understanding the mission, the vision, and the values of the organization, and they're motivated by that. But then they have their own personal mission, which is probably honestly tied to their well-being, the well-being of their family, both financial and mental. And if you can mesh them together so that you feel that professionally and personally you're really fulfilling what your goals are, it can only work out well for the relationship, right?
It can. The only thing I'd just say on that is that I think I would just challenge slightly this question of, is the employee mission statement only about their family and
Mm,
financial health? What we're finding, and I talked a lot about this in the book, of course, is that we know that our individual motivation goes well beyond those things. Those are important, but they're hygiene factors. They can stop us being demotivated. We all need to feel fairly paid, put our bread on the table for our loved ones, and so that's really important. But they're not deep motivators in themselves. So I would encourage every one of your listeners today to think about a mission statement that goes beyond that, the sense of hygiene factors, but also goes beyond their immediate employer. So let me just give you one example. Let me give you my personal mission statement. I find that these words, I help, to, and by, being very useful, so scaffold words. So I help organizations and leaders to discover their true motivation, direction, and potential by writing, advising, and coaching. Right? So in a few words, I've sort of expressed something that is a long-lasting mission statement of mine. It goes
right.
beyond just putting it on the table. And I think the role of an organization is then to look at that and say, how do we help that person achieve it as well?
I can see that. Yeah. And it's not necessarily tied to the specific position you happen to have at that particular time. It's more of a lifelong goal that's speaking to like your skills and your values that you could actually use anywhere, not necessarily at that one organization or that one particular job.
Yeah, I know exactly. That's why I think it's powerful. I think what can often happen is employers can say, look, I don't, who cares about long term? I just want the employee to
Right.
make impact now, get results now. It's a very common way of thinking for many employers. The challenge with that is you have the worst of both worlds, where the employee doesn't feel they're really valued and they don't feel they have a stake in the ground on this stuff as well. They are definitely not going to achieve the long-term direction under that, but they're also probably going to be not very happy and fulfilled in their current work. And actually, ironically, that increases the chance they may leave the organization or company in the process. So what we're learning, which is it's almost paradoxical, but the best way to help an employee stay in a role, stay in an organization, not necessarily a role, but an organization, is to help them achieve a mission statement that is beyond the organization. And
Yeah.
it's a very different way of thinking about it, but I think actually, if we use that sort of mindset, that mental model, that's a much better formula for retaining staff and employees.
Yeah. No, that makes an awful lot of sense to me. And so when you think of the ultimatums that have come out by several CEOs lately about return to office and basically you either like it or you don't like it, and we need you to do this right now. It's the exact wrong way to motivate people, right?
Yeah, and actually, I wrote a piece in Inc. recently with Sheila Subramanian at Slack and Salesforce around this topic. And what we were writing about was this idea that I think rather than obsess on the policy, let's focus on the why and make a really good argument. So I know some Wall Street bosses have asked for pretty much, let's go back to where we came from before the pandemic. There's no right answer on this, but I think the test for a leader is not just to go back to a certain model because you're comfortable with that model. What is the rationale? Why is it so important? What are you going to do with these days in the office that is going to be fundamentally different? Because what I think, if we have the policy, we go back to the office and we're all on Zoom screens or Team screens and trying to shout over each other and different things, that's not going to be, most people are not going to believe that argument. So we've really got to think about the nature of the work itself and how are we trying to really, what's the why? Why do we believe it's so important? I think there is a strong reason to meet together regularly, whatever the frequency is, but how can we articulate that? How can we use this also to promote the sense of autonomy that you talked about?
Right.
There is more flexibility. How can we give our workers more leadership and more freedom to drive things they want to? It's a great opportunity to take that on. And the last thing I think is that we tend to underplay the role of managers, especially the middle of organizations, in creating day-to-day culture. And as a result, that's why I think a lot of the sort of this clash over the rest of the office has happened. We don't see their value as much as we should. If we could really empower and train our managers and develop them to be great nurturers, to really bring the best out of their employees, there's a much more obvious reason to be in the office, which is to spend time with them, not just formal time, but informal nurturing time as well.
So, an awful lot of managers have never really been trained properly how to nurture. So, really, what has to happen to make that feasible and possible?
So I'm on a mission to do this now with a number of organizations. And I think when I talked about in the book, this concept of nurturing was trying to market it differently from traditional styles of management. So you've got the kind of management by instruction, the kind of top-down command and control mindset that most organizations, let's be honest, have run on for the last 50 to 100 years. That we know doesn't work, especially with knowledge work and workers who feel they want to be part of the process. They want to drive things along with their organizations. That's out. I trained as a coach. I'm a big fan of coaching, but what I found with coaching was that the ultimate, at least the pure forms of coaching, there's an assumption the client has all the answers. And let's say you are a manager trying to coach a younger employee, they may not have just seen enough in the world in terms of patterns, connections, mental models. There's a lot that you've got to do to actually help them see the world differently as well. So what we need is to go beyond coaching. The final model that's out there, which is around mentoring, which is this is what I did when I was successful. That kind of copy paste model doesn't generally work that well because everyone's situation is unique. And even if there is similar, there's a natural defensiveness in feeling like, okay, this person's coming in to tell me, just to share what they did and not listen to my reality. So I talked about in the book about this kind of almost fourth way called nurturing, which is in between these sort of ways of leading. And it's really about helping the person get to a place they wouldn't have got to otherwise, helping them be the best version of themselves, not the version you think they should be, not necessarily having the answers, but knowing how to ask the right questions at the right time. So those are some of the traits of good nurturers. I think it can be very strongly developed, but the key is to build a systematic nurturing program for those leaders, and the one that is experiential, that gives them a chance to figure this out together and for them to define their own, what I call a nurturing proposition, or where do they really want to go? What kind of nurturer do they really want to be?
Exactly. So, a couple of questions here, too. So, really, you're talking about coaching, but the autonomy really is for the person who's being coached, for them to speak up and just say, this is what I need. How can you help me get there?
It's this really interesting dance where I think definitely the nurturee, right, in my language, is the person who needs to be at the forefront. What's critical is for them to stay deeply motivated in what they do. So much coaching, quote unquote, or managing or mentoring tends to destroy motivation. It tends to compare, first of all, that person to some other person or set of people. It tries to it takes a deficit mindset. It tends to try to focus on those that, quote unquote, have talent. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, I know. And it doesn't see the best in every person. But at the same time, I think great nurturing does play that critical friend role. It does mean that you have to ask awkward questions sometimes. It means you have to challenge sometimes. You have to argue it and help the person see the world differently. So it's that really interesting sort of middle ground, which can be uncomfortable at times, but I think is really critical to unlock a really great potential in anyone.
Yeah, no, I love that. So, managers would have to really be rewarded in different ways. So, it's not really just hitting targets and quotas, and so their objectives would have to be changed as well. Like, honestly, it's almost like we're redesigning the expectations for leaders and managers as well, too.
I think a lot of this is really around, I do believe we should measure things, of course, but I think what it requires us to do is take a much longer term time frame, first of all. So I think when you think about anything to do with potential, it's about how do you take the existing energy and capacity that's there. Of course, let's convert it, but how do we build potential for long term? Because that's the only way to drive sustainable growth, right? And we're in a period where the economic environment's been uncertain. What we've got to be doing is really developing organizations and companies that have long-term value, that really there's something solid underneath all this. And that's more and more now about people. How do we really try to have the best collective bench strength in the organization? What we've tended to do before is very much take a winner takes all mindset that I talked about in the book in Intrinsic, that we look for these high performers. We were talking about this, I know, earlier today. And nowadays, the world of work is profoundly what I call in the book wicked. There's no easy technical solution. It's very messy. It's about human relationships primarily. It's about how we coordinate and bring things together, integrate things. You can never make really objective judgments of who is high potential or not as a result of that. There's always going to be a high margin for error. So instead of that kind of old way of thinking, let's embrace a different way, which is to say, let's try and create an environment where everyone's potential can be nurtured. We've got the technology now, we've got the ability through our management layers to do that. And I think that means also thinking differently about diversity, rather than just designing something for minorities in whatever sense. That's really important. But how do we create work environments where where diversity really flourishes in every sense? Obviously, gender, in terms of ethnicity, all those things, but also cognitively, right? In terms of people who think differently, act differently, have different ways of being. How can they all feel comfortable in that organization? I feel they can contribute fairly and well to that organization and are recognized as well. If we can flip to that kind of idea of potential for all, I think it's a very different kind of organization we're running, and one that I think everyone feels genuinely has skin in the game and feels motivated.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So how does technology fuel that?
So I think technology can do really one of the things that is really important to get to a good nurturing organization is around mastery. And that's that sense, again, it's not competition, it's not comparing ourselves, it's getting better every day. It's about every day becoming the best version of ourselves over time. And what's incredible now, obviously, what technology has done, the pandemic has done, is opened up all these resources, right, to knowledge, expertise, insights. I was on a fantastic webinar just earlier today, learning about some new ideas around career direction. So I invest all the time learning and listening and thinking about what other people are thinking about at the moment as well. How do we try and create that? The challenge with that, all that stuff is out there, but there's no kind of curation. It's very hard to create a plan based on all that stuff around where you want to go in these softer human elements of mastery. And that's where the world of work is valuing more and more. It's not the technical skills quite so much. That's important, of course, but it's these human skills. And what we need is better frameworks around what does it really mean to be a master in those elements, or develop mastery, I should say, in those elements. If companies can create those models, create those frameworks, and provide loose ways that employees can develop them and give them ideas on how they can do that, but leave the initiative to them, it's a very different kind of organization because everyone is growing potential at the same time. We don't need to exclude people. We don't need to cherry pick. It is possible for everyone to go on that journey.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate inclusion strategy.
That's a nice way of putting it, though. Yeah, exactly. So it can be that. And I think what that means is taking a more deliberate view. So let me just give you one example. Many organizations still use competencies as a way of thinking, right? These are the competencies to get from level 1 to level 2, whatever it might be. The challenge with competencies is it leaves a lot of room open for, did you even have the chance to demonstrate those things? It's great if you do, but often you may find that projects are already taken up by people. So all the really exciting stretch projects, which are really critical for developing those competencies, are already taken up, right? So you don't even have a seat at the table. So I think what companies have got to do is think more about experiences. How can they create experiences and map those so that it's left less to chance, right? So everyone has a rite of passage. So everyone in a professional services firm, as an example, should have to deal with a difficult client engagement at some point early on in their careers. If you haven't, you've missed a big part of your mastery. If you leave it to chance and just say, look, it's all going to happen when it happens, that's again very hit and miss. But instead, if you can curate that and say, look, we're going to create an opportunity for you that we know this client is, that you're going to be the one leading the meeting, as an example, but someone is there to support you as well. It's that slightly more curated version of how we think about development, giving people the chance to develop that mastery, leaving a lot less to chance.
And so it's like ongoing experiences as well. It's almost like a choose your own adventure kind of pathway through the organizations. Like you start here, and then what option do you take? You're going to accumulate mastery, either choice, but you have a structure and a framework that you can go through.
Yeah, and I think focusing less on the immediate, the next role, something that can really make us obsessive about our career direction in the short term.
Yeah.
But just trust that if you get these experiences and develop them well, that will develop such a lot of transferable mastery that you can almost go into any role that's available at the time with the company. So I think that would just change the mindset, would make it much more adventurous, much more playful, I think, to build on what you're saying, Nola, and allow a lot more diversity of experiences to happen, but still enable some core core things to be mastered on the journey for everyone. And it's that question of autonomy. People don't want to be micromanaged, but they want to know that if they're going to spend 5 years in an organization, they will develop those key mastery essentials that are going to be really important for transferability.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's right. So I keep coming back to game theory. Does this come up for you a lot? Because game design really, you mentioned being playful. Game design seems to permeate into a lot of different places because it's intrinsic, right? Like people choose to play games. Those concepts, can we apply that to work? And it's not necessarily like collecting tokens or slaying villains or anything like that, but it's like, how can we choose aspects of work that are going to be playful and make us want to show up and do the work and feel like we're enjoying?
So I think some of it is around this idea of, if you think about game theory in the pure sense, like I'm an economist by training, it's that idea of the prisoner's dilemma, right? That basically what's happening, I talked to a lot of senior leaders, they don't want to do this because, or they're worried about doing this because they worry if they're the first ones to do it, what's going to happen is employees are going to get skills, develop, they're going to go somewhere else. That comes up again in so many conversations. It's breaking that prisoner's dilemma problem and saying, look, I don't really care. We're going to be the best employer. We're going to make these investments. We're going to take that long-term perspective. Because as a leader, that's how I want to lead. I want to be that person. I want to be the same kind of person that I am at home. And those are my values, first of all. But there's also that second point we talked about, that if you do that, you're going to be much more respected as an employer. Employees are going to be much more engaged and deeply motivated intrinsically in what we're doing. They're going to stay the course. And also whatever time they are with you, they're going to be much more deeply engaged. That level of discretionary effort and focus and time is going to be so much higher. So I think we've got to break some of those that are thinking about. I think it's important for some organizations to take the lead and go for it. Others will then follow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where like alumni associations can be powerful as well too, because you may train your people so well that they do find other opportunities and they leave, but it doesn't mean that your relationship with them has to end, because you can invest in alumni services and then it becomes this whole referral process where employers really are actually collaborating and communicating and building those relationships and those integrations that actually helps everyone within an industry or even outside of an industry.
Yeah, and I think some of the best nurturers I talked about in the book are the ones that have kept nurturing even when their nurturee has left their organization. They've kept that relationship up. They've seen their role at a much broader level.
Yeah.
And I think it's really healthy for both people, but for an organization, it can be transformative. So I think some data I saw from McKinsey, which does that, what you described really well. I think half their business comes from alumni, right? So billions of dollars of consulting revenue every year. It's huge scale and very influential. They take pride in the fact people will leave the organization, but will go on to do great things. But the foundational mastery they developed in McKinsey is going to be game changing in that long-term career direction. So if we can see companies more and more like springboards, that while an employee is there with us, we want them to be deeply engaged and all in. But we also want to help them springboard to whatever comes up next. We know that we may not have all the opportunities to keep them forever. That's a good, normal thing. How can we do that? As you embrace that fact that network around those employees will continue, and we can have even deeper engagement with them in other ways as they become proud alumni, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's a different way of looking at employee advocacy, right? Like it's not just sharing the LinkedIn post and commenting on the company page, but it's just like a real in-depth network where the person and the individual is valued for what they know, how they know, and what they do, and how they can then bring that value to themselves, the industry, and other companies.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about what makes networks motivating, and I think the key thing that's coming up again and again, my practical research on some of this has been. I gave a talk to Daimler recently around this topic, and one of this was this idea that networks are about people, right? I think that LinkedIn page is a great example where no one is going to be very passionate about a corporate LinkedIn page. I think back to my time at Strategy which is one of the strat consulting firms, is now part of PwC. What I really remember is these amazing people that I often spent days with, or long periods on client sites with. It's that community of people, that network of people, that to me is the key to my association back with my old employer. So how do we create these rich networks which are people to people driven, that really are about genuine networks that allow those people to keep reconnecting? It's not the corporate, here's the new website and
Right.
our new product or policy or service or whatever as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I actually feel a lot of organizations really fall short in the employee experiences. They bring in new employees, they onboard them, they get them in comfortable within their job, and then it stops. So what's re-engaging people, right? There's no ongoing onboarding process or reboarding process that helps them maintain that relationship, right? It's almost like that nurturing stops.
Yeah, I think exactly. And as you said, there's a lot at the beginning of a work relationship. The challenge is we hit this idea of plateauing comes very quickly. And what tends to happen is that induction training or onboarding is good, but it tends to focus a lot on the technical side. So these are the key technical skills to master the website or the accounts payable department or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But those transferable mastery, what we're learning more and more is that those who stay on an organization, a lot of their value comes from being able to connect the organization together and build strong social capital. People do this instinctively, but it's almost never trained or developed properly. And so again, it's left to chance. Whereas I think a lot of that seniority and tenure can be harnessed so powerfully. I'm doing a lot of growth with very fast growing companies, Shopify and so on, where companies are growing at breathtaking speed. Well, in those kinds of situations, the glue of having those people who understand the culture, they know how decisions work, know who key people are, that's really powerful. So we should consciously develop that in our employee bases at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And breaking down silos essentially is what you're talking about, right? Now, Shopify is a Canadian company. So they're interesting because they also are remote. So are you finding that being remote is actually any kind of barrier to building that relationship and that glue and really engaging the people with the seniority and the tenure?
So I think it can happen, as you mentioned, and I can share this, but obviously Shopify, one of the things it does really powerfully is it has these bursts. So every few months is digital first, but every few months employees can come together and expect to come together in person, spend a week together, a deep experience. There are lots of ways of enabling that connection to happen. It doesn't have to be entirely through physical contact at all. The key thing, I think, whatever organization you are, whatever way you want to go on, either hybrid or digital first, or even walk every day in the office, all of these options are possible. It goes back to what is your view of work and why is that so important? So, for example, what is the mental model of work? Is it about you need people to be in the same place at the same time to build an idea? If so, make that really conscious in how you're building the work experience around that. If it's more like a baton, I was just having Grant talk about this recently, then is there a better way where some of that can happen before people meet? So when they do meet in person, there's already a lot of time to engage and think about something so they're at a point where they can deeply collaborate. The last thing to think about is this kind of cognitive diversity point about Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast, thinking slow. Some people, myself, we like to think on our feet and we're very happy doing everything in that kind of mode. Other people want some time to think by themselves. They want that quiet time, maybe at home, to do that. So when they come into the workshop or the meeting, which could be in person, they've already had that ground laid. So I think there's no right answer on this, but what's important is it's intentional, and it's not seeing the office, whatever the outcome is, as the end goal. As you said, it's a hygiene factor.
Right.
It's more we going back to what is the core of the work in my organization? What's the real nature of it? How do I motivate people to really want to do it well? And then the office solution will almost fall out of that discussion. It's almost like the horse and the cart. Whereas I think I see a lot of carts leading horses right now in this hybrid discussion.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when I got to that part of your book, that's where I reached out to you to see if you would actually be on the podcast, because I really talk a lot about hybrid remote work on an ongoing basis. And when I got to that part in your book, it was just like, okay, this whole discussion about whether it's office, whether it's hybrid remote, whether it's virtual first or whatever you want to call it, work from anywhere, it's all a hygiene factor. What matters is the work and making the work itself more intentional and making it more engaging. So.
Yeah, and I think as well as that building that deep connection, or to just build one further thing, how do you feel the connection to human beings as part of the work process?
Yeah.
And that could be done fully digitally. There's no issue with that. But how do you make it out so it comes out very strongly, so it feels very human at the core? What's happened, and I sort of understand why many leaders are knee-jerking back to where the world was before, because what they're sensing is this strong, almost a streak of individualism that's come through the pandemic, which is, look, let me just do my work. It's very transactional. I talk in the book about this idea of people seeing work as kind, i.e. technical and stable, where really the future of work is wicked. It's about the messiness, the human nature of it. I think what we have to be very careful about is not seeing work in these kind of very tight boxes where this is my task, I did it, it's done. That's very rarely what work is now.
Yeah.
So it's just some way to create that sense of connection and interdependency between people in the workforce. But that can be done in a range of ways, in a range of environments.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I'm finding that people are having a really hard time letting go of narratives, like their personal narrative of this is the way work has always been. This is what made me successful. I was successful because I was in the office and I was able to have these in-person connections, have drinks after work and be seen and be visible at the water cooler, the fabulous water cooler where magical things always happen, never actually happened ever to me. People are having a really hard time letting go of that narrative because it's almost like it's the only way that they know how to teach anybody about how work worked. And it's a mindset shift, I find, for a lot of managers as well. And it's emotional. I actually had a discussion with somebody who had been on my podcast previously. And the discussion was basically like she felt that people were almost selfish to not want to go back to the office because people have a need for people and connection.
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, two really powerful points. So on the first one, I think that this water cooler example, right? So there is that element. So I remember like in consulting when I was a young associate, it was a 5 minutes in the elevator with the partner at the end of the meeting where he said, Sharath, this is why I did this. This is why I said talk to the client this way, or how I handled this question. It was very powerful. It's harder to do on Teams or Zoom or WebEx or whatever, but it can be done. So again, it's about, okay, if you're not going to do that, if you, for example, you're going fully digital first, make sure you build in 10 minutes at the end of the meeting, which is just for a pure debrief, really unstructured, what went well, but even better. If it just means we have to be even more conscious in doing that. I think in some ways there is a beautiful serendipity of being in person, but just to avoid over romanticizing that, as you said, no, let me give you one stat. So on the water cooler conversation stuff, I was talking to Professor Sharath Jeevan at the Harvard Business School. He told me when I wrote the book, and he told me that about you're 80% less likely to interact with someone if they're on a different floor of the same building. So you're in the same building, the same physical place. You made the trip to the office, so you're not selfish, but you just happen to be in a different floor, wrong floor. You're very unlikely to talk to that person.
Yep.
So again, I think that's also not great. So what we should be doing is looking back at what we did before and saying, let's make it even better. How do we create this so we do go, and if you're in the office, go and walk the corridors and make that part of how we think about leading and managing there.
Yeah.
So I think that, yeah, so I think a lot of it is about, let's not just go back to what we did in the past. Let's actually build something that really has the best of both worlds. It tries to bring what we've learned and really is tailor-made for the kind of work we want to try to do.
Yeah. So in the book, you mentioned that you spend an awful lot of time traveling before the pre-pandemic, and now you have the opportunity to be home more, engage with your children and play cricket and all of that stuff. Are you finding that's hard to retain? Is there a pull to be back out in the world and traveling as much?
So I think, again, it's about conscious choices. I'm definitely feeling pulled, I think, as well, working for very global organizations right now. But I think, honestly, I think it's also being clear what's important as well. And so what I try to do is think about what are the things that really are important to be in person for. And often that's about relationship building. So I do quite a lot of work with groups in the States, in North America. A lot of that can be done virtually, but when that person is coming through London's a pretty big base for travel, we try and meet in person, for example, as well. And yes, I'm happy to go and travel for a few days to North America, for example, but let's do it in a bunch of days, which is really efficient. I think what I don't want to be doing is going for one meeting and it was very inefficient. It's not good for our planet. It's also just not great value for a client that I'm working with as well. So just being more, just designing this more intentionally, think how do we make the most of travel? When I am traveling, I really want it to count. I wanted to make sure it's genuinely very human. I'm not just doing regular meetings that I could do online. or it really is a chance to build, to get to know the person better, have a drink with them or have dinner or whatever it might be. That's really important as well. So just redesigning things and just being a little bit more selective in how I spend time, I think is really important as well.
Oh, that's good. Earlier this year, how people select words of the year. My word was intention. So I think I chose.
I think it's a year to be intentional because we are coming back. And again, I think that easy reaction, let's just go back to what happened before, that we weren't in a great place. And let's really be clear, we were in difficult times motivationally before the pandemic. 84% of people around the world are not happy at work. That was in 2019. So it's not some romantic thing that is we're going back to. We've got to build something now much better, but use all of the advantages and the rich learning we've had over these couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. It's more about what we're walking towards.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to go backwards. We want to walk towards something. Yeah, that's cool. All right. I think I'll wrap that up. Is there anything in particular you would like to leave the people with? Your website, LinkedIn?
Yeah, so please follow me on LinkedIn. It's my name under there as well. I write quite regularly on topics around motivation, direction, potential. Intrinsic is on Amazon. It's on Kindle and Audible right now in the States, but is coming out in September in full physical form. And just reach out to me. My website is Intrinsic-Labs, so intrinsic-labs.com. Love working with leaders across sectors. If you're facing a challenge around motivation, potential, or direction, I love working with great leaders and helping them put these ideas into practice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll make sure all that's in the show notes as well too. So Sharath, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Noah. I really enjoyed the conversation.